of this 29 billion tons of carbon, only about 8% is in protected areas. So this is all pretty intact locations, but it doesn't have any formal protection next. And a few years ago now, once we mapped the peatlands originally, then we overlaid the potential oil blocks. This is an oil palm concession. I don't know what's happening here.
Is that in ROC?
It's in ROC,
Okay.
yeah. I don't think it's happened yet,
No.
but it's slated to happen. Similarly, the oil blocks were not slated to happen, but now potentially will. And then there's all these logging concessions that were stopped in the moratorium in 2002, and a couple of them have been said they're going to come back and have been sold and then taken away. It's unclear to me what's happening with these logging concessions, but huge amounts over the peatlands, which would be very, very damaging should they go ahead. And there is one species in the peatland that I see as high value timber, which I was surprised about. You don't see it on the ROC side, but you do see it on the DRC side. So there's some potential about why people would want to do some logging. Next. And then what about this oil exploration? Next slide.
Is that it?
Yeah.
That's the map.
So we at real speed, we map the humid forests in green, and then in yellow the peatlands, and then overlay the oil blocks. And what we see then is there's 11 million hectares of tropical forest within these oil blocks, and about 1 million hectares of peatland within these oil blocks, mostly 4, 40, and 22. And thinking about the carbon, so there's all the potential impacts from the exploration. So the first would be opening up the forest, where you have to have a high density of openings to do the seismic testing. And that would obviously open the forest to potentially to illegal wildlife, hunting, open it to illegal logging, and then the infrastructure itself to get all the equipment there before you even find out whether you've got any oil or not. And then should oil come, then you have more infrastructure, more influx of people, and obviously the potential for big pollution events, particularly in the peatlands, because it's all connected by water. You know, the peat when it's wet is around 90% water inflow. And in terms of the carbon, if you look at the carbon stocks of the trees in those 11 million hectares, and I think that's 5.5 billion tons of carbon. And the carbon in the peat is another 6.8 billion tons of carbon in the oil concessions. So you can do a calculation where the Congolese government thinks its top estimate is they'll get around 22 billion barrels of oil from all of these concessions. That's their public figure. Now, if you convert the carbon that's in the peatlands and the forests, then that's the same amount of carbon as in 27 billion barrels of oil. So there's actually more carbon in the forest and the peat than it will actually get from the oil, if it all goes really well, from the oil drilling perspective. And what that shows is if you have deforestation and the loss of carbon from the peatlands, even not all of it, if you have a significant amount, then that oil from the rainforest oil will be more damaging just from a carbon perspective than burning coal. And the world has basically agreed that burning coal is too much and we should move to much lower carbon forms. So I don't know what's going to happen with this going forward, and it's obviously a decision for the Congolese people, but the crucial thing is that studies are needed to understand what the implications are of going down particular avenues.
Yeah, there is a study that I would be very much interested to see if it exists. It's the so there is an estimate of the oil that could be in there.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, it could be. But then there is, like, of course, the price of barrels is public knowledge. But what's the margin that's actually going to be left for the government?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Versus what they could get over 20 years in terms of carbon credit if we at some point managed to pay them for storage fees, kind of, and then go to them with that balance. Yeah, that would be good. Do you know if anything like that has been done?
I don't.
So, I think that is, well, everyone knows it. I think that is actually one of the main topics that governments that are concerned about this are trying to figure out. And actually, one of the things I was going to follow up with you on
Okay.
our meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Because I know ICCN is definitely one of the partners that a lot of our governments turn to. And if we can find ways to work with ICCN and MED to empower the positive aspects of the government on this issue, I think we could see some really great energy. No pun intended.
Yes. No. Yes. No. We've had some initial discussions on that with Kevin as well. Like on what kind of study should be useful. Now, what I've said is that at ICCN we're very much concerned. Also, we have it's been technical, but we are supposed to have conseil d'administration. Like we're supposed to have a board of directors, which we don't, and therefore we cannot speak without the approval of the MED, Minister of l'Environnement and Développement.
Yep.
So right now we're just like, we can't say anything, but we would be happy to contribute into the studies.
Which we're all in a safe space. Just want to put that out there.
Yeah.
Great.
Good. Next. And I just want to show this one example that you can, the peatlands are incredibly sensitive to changes in the drainage. So, the crucial thing is keep the peatlands wet, but you've also got to keep the hydrology the same as it's been. And this is a photo from 1984. There's a logging camp on your left and a road, and the dark green bits on the left is the terra firma forest for the selective logging, and the light green is all wetland forest, and we think that there is peat markings. And that's what it looks like in 2080. And what's happened, we think, is that this road has changed the drainage and has killed everything as far as the eye can see. And it goes on for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. This band of wetland.
What was the
And
date?
1984. And this was an accident. This is just build a road without thinking. And then you've essentially killed all the peatland and you've killed all the trees and we're not sure what's happening with the peat and the carbon. But it just shows that you can really make big impacts accidentally by really modestly changing the drainage. Next. And then I just want to finish up with thinking about the future. And I've been working with Lee White, the Minister for Environment in Gabon, to think about what would transforming the science base in the Congo Basin take. And there's a really good precedent in the 1990s in Brazil. They had a big project, mostly funded by the US government, along with Brazil, called the LBA, the large-scale biosphere atmosphere experiment. And they trained around 800 masters and PhD students from Brazil and other Latin American countries in the Amazon Basin, and completely transformed rainforest science in Brazil. Nowadays, it's almost all done by Brazilians and not from people overseas. And that was part of the building up the capacity to do this really good monitoring that Matt discussed. I think the time is right to do something like that in the Congo Basin. You know, funded, run by scientists, for scientists, very curiosity driven, but in the framework of understanding the Congo Basin in the context of the climate system. I think that's the end. Yeah, you can go back to an additional slide. Great.
Good.
I'll obviously have to have
I mean, it's interesting, the lesson from Indonesia, which is like, 100,000 added deaths from the 2015 fires. Like they say the 2015 fires cost more economically than the tsunami. So it's like these spin-off, these multiplier effects, smoke, closes down the Singapore airport, all kinds of. So these kind of things also, you can't anticipate. You've got some.
Well, you can now.
Yeah.
You know, when I
can.
get talked to government, you're like, don't go down the Indonesia route.
That's right.
We went to, with the Ministry of Environment for Republic of Congo, to Indonesia to go and have a look. And to really, see. And they are investing a huge amount in just the fire service in the tropics to deal with these fires on peak. And we went to a demonstration about how they can, mobilize 1,000 firefighters to try and put these things out. It's enormous costs. And the 2015 El Nino fires, I think it stands rightly, 500,000 people in the region went to hospital with respiratory problems. That was a colossal impact.
So again, recognizing safe space, and we have colleagues from Congolese government, but also from other countries here. Just want to ask, when you have brought up these issues to the government of the DRC, what has been the response?
So on the oil exploration, it was not talked about on this trip, really. So I brought it up briefly in my talk, but we have a very short amount of time to present, and Matt briefly brought it up. But aside from that, no one talked about it.
Then what about, questions about these different spirals, such as fire and the peatlands disappearing if they're not protected, etc.?
I think it comes back to the same. There needs to be funding to do the protection if they're going to forego the other opportunities.
Right.
Conversation pretty much quickly comes back.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Speaking of Yangambe, given you guys have just come back, I wonder if you could give a very frank assessment or summary of what happens, what was concluded, and the sort of discussions that were being had. Because from what I've heard from you and Sam Jeremy, science was not on the agenda for the scientific conference. It was politicized heavily. So I'm just curious, actually, what tangibly has come out of this? You've got this declaration, which I haven't seen yet. I think once after that, I haven't looked at it yet. Your opinion, your assessment, and sort of any highlights or positives, and any sort of big scary things that were really, really horrible. Not from a logistical perspective, from a policy perspective. That's quite obvious.
What about the snakes?
Toilet situation, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I actually, it's weird, and I'm split on this, because I actually cheered them on in the sense that, I think the global north, and especially, obviously the west, I'm from a deforestation landscape. Indiana is 90% deforested. There are 2 patches of old growth forest left by clerical air. And so, there's no deforestation commodities coming out of there. And if you're going to say to these countries they're going to give up that pathway of development, because for whatever reason, they just got to be compensated. So there has to be, I think that this oil stuff is maybe even, leverage, because maybe they never get anything out of it, but it could be that kind of thing. But I I see that kind of sense from them that there's a lot of promises. I thought the tenor of it was a lot of complaining about that, about the lack of funding and things like support from these programs to support their science and also their policy implementation. So I thought a lot on the negative side, it really wasn't science. It was a lot, almost all the comments were bigger kind of picture stuff on, we don't have resources, et cetera, et cetera. So in that way, it was disappointing, but it also kind of reflected, I don't know, a lack of, when I wrote up some bullet points for him, it was just purely science on programmatic approaches to science and, identifying core areas, focal areas for supporting policy and education and instrumentation, all that stuff. That really wasn't the focus of the preamble, the declaration.
Exactly. When we make comments about, this would be about standardizing methods across so that, we can all use each other's data and get a better picture of the all standard. That's not the audience for that.
No.
In terms of the science, I think it's basically accepted that, the peatlands exist and they're really important for carbon. The forest exists is really important for carbon uptake and for biodiversity. And that's all accepted, and the discussion now is, okay, now what? And that's what that conference was mostly about. And I think there is the slowness of the climate finance money arriving. The big pledges in Glasgow of 1.5 billion is coming to the Congo Basin, and I was a bit like, nothing's changed, what is it? And fair enough in lots of ways. Congo Basin gets very little of the climate finance money that goes towards forest-related activities, compared to the Amazon and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, just to follow up on that also, because it's the government who invited people to this conference and etc. And of course, there's a big responsibility from the global north with the financing part. But it's also interesting to hear if they during the conference took any sort of stance, we will do this or we will improve this. When we received budgets for arranging the pre-COP. Even the minister wanted $500 per day just to show up when it was going to be Kinshasa. Is there any specific, political, nothing to say, okay, yeah, we will also do our part in this. We will work together, or it's more like just give us the money. You see the
I did think that there was a lack of concrete activities of this is what we would like to do with some of this funding. I do think that was missing, and that it's partly a thing that reducing deforestation in this context is an incredibly difficult job that I don't think anyone has the answer to. Everyone has part of the answer, but I don't think there isn't a simple clean solution to this that can be funded and you get your outcome.
But the wetlands today are not exploited, and it's
Yeah.
against the law of logging, so they are wholly intact. There's a really community there to try to lock them in, should be locked in. Really.
Yeah.
And, sir,
And there's very few people living there. It's not an identity place. Particularly on the Republic of Congo side, but also on this.
Well, thanks to you both for taking your time to do an extra day. I'm sure you're probably quite exhausted. It was very interesting to see your presentation.
We are obviously very concerned about these oil blocks. They may or may not be realistic. We don't know exactly what is going on, but I think our vantage point is that it should be taken seriously. And we will discuss among our colleagues against the Reds, the Swedes, and our approach. But at the country secretariat and also at the ministry, we did a layman analysis of we arranged the blocks from least to the most cover of forest inside the blocks. So it seemed to us like the 15 blocks with the least forest inside them represent only 1% of the total forest within all of the 30 blocks. So that seemed to us like a very good vantage point to start, talking with the government. Where should you prioritize? And then there are some of those remaining 50 that also overlap with some natural reserves. I think
4 of them, so you're left with 11 blocks that are kind of relatively unproblematic. But I wonder, you know, this is just something we've looked at from like a layman's background, but if that is something that, you know, you would also just take a quick look at and get kind of that scientific stamp on that, I think that could be very, very helpful. And then I think it's, you know, it's back to what you said, Matt, you know, where how do you optimize the development schemes? And here, you know, I think what we can do is try at least to point to some win-win solutions for the government, for ensuring transparency and good governance of the resources that are relatively unproblematic, versus an acknowledgement of the importance of leaving some of their land untouched. So I'm very look forward to sort of keep looking into what approach can be, but having you already been there, knowing the actors, and also of course being the expert on science, it would be great to keep in touch also on sort of the analysis of that.
Of course. It reminds me that one of the journalists who was there got an interview with the Minister of Environment and asked her about the oil blocks. And he said there were like 5 or 6 problematic blocks.
So some background on that.
I don't know which ones they are.
Background on that.
You look guilty.
I mean, again, Chatham, I'm among friends, I don't need to say that. So, this 5 to 6 number was based on some of the earliest conversations that the US held with DRC. And there were also some conversations that you and I had before more research could be done to establish a higher baseline. Our understanding is that MED is flexible on this number. Now, what I will say to everybody here is time is, you know, of the essence in terms of win-win situations. I think it is very possible to have some kind of positive announcement at pre-COP. However, we need to rally our shared resources and insights and keep, you know, a very unified message. And so, as I've said before, US government efforts around the working group are very much open. We think it is an effective pathway, especially considering that Secretary Blinken discussed this directly with President Tshisekedi. This goes higher than MED, it goes up to Tshisekedi. And it's possible to assess that the myriad stories that led up to this oil auction, someone at some point didn't realize there were going to be blocks that would raise the international concern. And there may be a pathway out of things. I think we all need to work together to help them find that pathway out of things. Over the next few weeks, if we can all be in conversation, help pool the resources, I think we can have some success. I know that was a lot of generalities, but as I've said before, I'm always happy to speak one-on-one and get more specific. Does that help answer some of that?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really a question, but I'm glad that's
Yeah, well, or it gives the story behind the 6. Yeah.
I mean, from a kind of, you know, like a science, you know, thinking about science, you've got the blocks in the middle of the basin, which are just a disaster for the climate, because you're going to open up the whole of the basin once you open up those central blocks. And then you've got a different problem on the Rift Valley, where you've got all of those montane blocks, where obviously they're easier to get in a way, because you can do the pipeline the other way. And on the Uganda side, they're already doing some oil exploration, and you've got a pipeline out. But then you have the biodiversity issue, because it's both incredibly full of endemic species, because you've got the altitudinal gradient, and also as the climate warms rapidly this century, they're the refuge. So
These are really tricky because of those refuges and mountains. And it's either really high population densities that you cannot easily put a bunch of infrastructure onto it, or high individual. So there are, yeah, you talked about those. You talked about handling some particular areas in the east. I think there's an implication there.
Yeah.
To add to the list or something.
Yeah.
So certainly the encouragement to, do a couple of the blocks first that are like not in the main basin and not high biodiversity, so that they can, learn what works and how to do it rather than trying to go for this 20 blocks at a time, 27 blocks.
Yeah. Some comments and questions on. So I think that they wanted international. This wasn't a mistake. I think they wanted that knowledge. I mean, we had MONUSCO attack the same week as the president didn't deal with that, but he went out and presented the oil options. So I mean, of course, they wanted attention. I think that's a tactic also. But I think also to mention is this like when the minister says, oh, these are the problematic ones and they're the non-problematic ones. I mean, what is the scientific definition of problematic? I think we need to look first, because I've heard everything from 5, 6, sometimes they say 13, sometimes they say 21. It's a lot of different numbers out there, and I'm just questioning, like from just pure scientifically, the word problematic is not defined at all here, in one sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's something to also, how can we get that aspect and how do we define the things? But one important question, I thought a lot of the idea of this conference was to try to get out, like, how should we measure scientifically and get united on how we value the forest and the peatlands, right? So my questions to you guys that are experts in this field is more like pure, measuring wise, and with your tools that you have, at what level are you at the moment to try to do some sort of evaluation of, okay, how is, the stock-wise, the changes with the atmosphere, value versus, both regarding carbon stock, but also other values, etc. I mean, sometimes you get the mixed messages from the scientific, world. What is, how far are they? What will these sort of like hard question based on the answer perhaps? But can you give some sort of, do you need a lot more research, or is it that you have some idea, or
So for the peatlands, we know very little. So we know something about the carbon stocks. We've done the first ever insect collections this year. If you talk to local people, they say, oh yeah, the fish that we're eating when they're young, they're living in the peatland, and then they swim out into the river. So they're actually producing a lot of food, but it's just people telling us that. And no studies on it. And so I think we're very far from giving even reasonably comprehensive picture of the resources in these peatlands and their true value. And then secondly, on the peatlands particularly, we built a mathematical representation of the peatlands, a model which can grow, grow the peatland over time, and seems to be working reasonably well. We don't have any funding to run that model at a large scale, so you could build what happens if you build a road, what happens if you drain it, what happens if you have an oil spill, how long does it take to go across the I don't have any idea for that, but we might be able to in a couple of years, if we had a couple of years of funding for that work.
And a couple of years of no exploration.
Yeah. There are very few scientists working in the region.
I think being because you guys are all scientists, obviously the research can go towards that, but I think we should take one step back and realize that this is just financial. It's economical. So we need to talk to one of the major oil producers that are not going to come here and ask them pay them, or they can do that as part of their social responsibility program, but just to make the whole study of what is going to cost in terms of capex and opex. We know that everything inside everything inside this country is a lot more expensive than anywhere else on the planet. to put it in or to put it out.
Yeah.
So the thing is, they have valuation on this oil stock, but what's the profit for those guys that are going to sign up? Yes, and out of that profit, how much is going to stay for the Congolese government? And that's basically is the figure that I think is not. It's not undoable. That's something that those oil people can easily give us, and then once we have the government revenue on that, then we can start a discussion of compensation.
Mhm.
But if we take the problem from a scientific perspective, you know, they just said that they don't really care. Like they said, you messed your place up, and you developed, and now we can do the
But
same.
there were discussions with Professor Melisi and the minister on this idea of ranking.
Of course.
They're cool, you know, so I think that's useful in itself. The other issues with the oil companies, Western versus whatever, that they may not want to touch this with
Yeah.
because
They don't.
it's not going to happen.
And-
And then you got these other companies that don't care. It's the same thing with logging, you know, the sustainable logging companies from whatever, you know, Switzerland. And then if they get pushed too far, they come to the Chinese, they threaten the Chinese will come in and just clear, you know, everything.
Well,
No, yeah,
and
of
that's
course.
what they held over our heads, that's,
Yeah, so that's,
Yeah,
so the question is, how do you not let it get that far? Because you gotta convince, I think, responsible oil people to get involved, I would imagine.
which, that is, you know, something that if any of our countries can, you know, make that call. Because another piece of it is that the Congolese government wants their ambitions treated with a degree of respect, whatever the motivations are. That the conversation, you know, from the vice prime minister saying, well, these are problematic and these are not problematic. The next thing she says is, so help us with the non-problematic blocks. Now, we all know, and she and staff probably know that these companies are not going to drill. It's just not financially sustainable. However, if we treat things with respect that everyone's speaking the truth and seriously and can find companies to do like what you mentioned, that A is, you know, playing diplomatic niceties where scientists and diplomats in this room, and sometimes diplomatic niceties is important. And then B, that would take time. And how much time is that going to take? Well, it may take just enough time to get us where we need elsewhere. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I mean, do we know now, the auctions have taken place theoretically?
It's a 3 to 6 month process.
So it's in process.
It's open till almost Christmas, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, and, you know, our understanding is that there's people in the government who are willing to wait for us to have our approach together too.
Before ending.
Before moving forward, or, I
Yeah.
mean, the message has been communicated on many levels where they should stay away from for now. A lot of this, I think, is about formalization.
Yeah. And can you give us an update on what's the status of this so-called task force or
Yeah,
working
the
group?
working group.
Yeah.
I actually have a meeting at 3 o'clock with Dr. Malassi and her FTA, her deputy chief of staff, to move the ball further. But our aspirations are to have one working level conversation on the working group in the next 2 weeks, and then potentially a principals level working group centered around pre-COP. First ambition is to address the oil auction question. And so once, you know, ducks are in a row between DC and DRC, and on the DC side, I'm going to be reaching out for feedback. And feedback will be received because, again, it's an open door policy here.
Just very curious, even if you do this like rank order thing about pre-comp, they say they come up with a more,
Yeah.
let's say more, what we would like to prioritize in terms of environmental impact. But their attitude, and I think it's right, like what do we get for, you know, these progressive ideas,
So-
what's their?
So the lead group involved in the US government is not currently environmental conservation, it is our economic growth office. And so what we're exploring are questions around carbon financing. Even ecotourism, which I know the Director General of ICCN mentioned in our meeting yesterday. other aspects of development. And again, many of you have been in this country much longer than I have, so you can correct me if this assumption is false, but my understanding, at least with Med and other positive interlocutors, is that it's not necessarily all the money right now, but it's pointing towards a pathway forward and treating the aspirations with respect.
So I should say as well, obviously the most sort of clear form of funding is the $500 million letter of intent from CAFI under the 1.5 billion pledge. And just to reassure people, and the conversation, this is why I'm sad that Leslie couldn't come today from CAFI, we're having really intense conversations, as you're aware, on getting that moving, getting that flowing. And I can tell you from the UK side, we're working a mile a minute at the moment to try and get funding out the door. You'd be surprised at how much is being dispersed already within that 1.5 billion. Actually, it's just, I think, the profile of it is not well publicized, and the government is not aware. But money is coming into the country through implementing partners. I think the bigger issue is the DRC government is either unaware or doesn't see the money, or both. And our formal hardline is we can't fund governments in this region for obvious reasons. So our question is, how do we resolve that issue? Through what mechanisms do we get government buy-in, which will influence these oil concessions ultimately, because it is the $500 million that they repeatedly bring up. We haven't seen a letter of intent money. We haven't seen the CAFI money. What's going on? COP26 was all talk and no action, which is not strictly true, but it is true to an extent. So their point is valid, but we need to work on getting it across on what we're doing essentially. And we are working on that actively with the conversation. So we chair, the UK and the US co-chair the donor college under CDFP, which is where this 1.5 billion sits as an institutional home. And we're having heaps of conversations literally every other day around publicizing this more. So stuff is coming for pre-COP and COP27, just to be aware. But we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
But we are actively working on it very, very hard, believe me.
I was just going to ask, is debt for nature a realistic or viable possibility as part of the mix? Or is that just, I don't know DRC's debt profile, but is that, I don't know if the Congolese government would be very interested in it, right? Particularly when there are some countries that are just forgiving debt. Really, sort of singing. But anyways, it's worked in the past in the Amazon. I don't know. If that's.
I think when it comes to that type of mechanism, the sort of theme of implementation, it's down to the donor individually with their funding. So the funding is under an umbrella, right? That each donor decides what program to design.
Yeah.
So it's on the options table for us, but I'm not sure what other donors are up to in that space. The big focus of the region where I'm here at the moment is the COP26 funding being committed to the UK for the Congo Basin. I'm now here to design the program that it feeds into, essentially. And for me, over the past 6 months of seeing and hearing things in the region, it's that frontier forest, that unprotected area, that community intervention, supply chain intervention, to stop this, to slow this artisanal logging activity, which is the biggest deforestation cause in the DRC, contrary to across the river where it's industrial logging. And you mentioned this, the plantations and sort of some of the sustainable logging companies that operate across the river, but also over there's some horrendous operations that are not in the north, that are not CIDs, that are Matondo is aware of and wants help to assist with, and doesn't really know what to do about it. Whereas here, as you say, it's all artisanal. That is the sort of intervention we want to really lean into. And what a big part of this program that I'm trying to design at the moment is around coordination of donors on programs. Because from my perspective, donors aren't speaking to each other enough on what their programs are doing in the region. So
Amen.
We want to know in the UK what the US, what the Norwegians, what everybody's doing and what's in the pipeline to say, well, let us back you up on that. Let us time that properly so when we finish, you take over. Because decadal interventions are necessary. You can't come in with a 3, 4, 5 year program and expect something to change. It just fails afterwards. That's what I've seen time and time again. So the regional coordination group is something we're looking at setting up for programs How that works with the GBEC, I don't know. How that works with CAFI, I don't know. That's a conversation to be had. But this is the sort of thinking we're having around the challenges and trying to solve them, because programs operating in isolation look nice in London and in DC, but they don't actually have a proper impact because they're not consolidated with all the other efforts in the region. So that's the sort of thinking we have as well, just for awareness.
That's great, that's great to hear.
Speaking to that, though, you probably work at the National EITI office, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is actually a national institution, national organization, but they have national offices, they have a national coordinator, so it's very much a Congolese. Their board is composed of the stakeholder group, civil society, private sector, but also government members at minister level. So they have a lot of authority and a lot of political convening power and outreach. And so we had a very interesting meeting with them on the oil blocks. And they said they were very willing to kind of try to help bring that debate up, ask the right questions, but then being the convening power rather than the donors. Acknowledge very well also that it is problematic to have always the donors coming in and trying to lift these debates or kind of frame questions and so on.
Well, that ties into what Simon, was saying earlier around researchers not being empowered in the region and the need for autonomizing research and institutionalizing research capacity across the region. That's the same for everything. With these sort of coordination and convening powers, it needs to be an in-country organization.
So much better.
I'm just looking at the time and knowing that we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure we can, move this conversation the two of you have helped inspire in a positive direction. My first question, Leon, with GBEC, how much longer are the Dutch, is the Dutch ambassador the chair?
So until March next year.
Got it. So well, and then the Brits. So one thing that I'm personally seeing very helpful here is us having more of a free-form discussion, and maybe, if it's possible, if maybe under the auspices of GBEC, like to have us in a room just drill down on a topic at some point. I don't know if that would violate the protocols, but maybe like have this kind of working level conversation. Chatham House rules, be open and bounce ideas off, or a few of those. If you and the Dutch Embassy find that helpful, I think US would at least be interested.
Yeah, so I have to discuss with Ambassador York, and maybe I'll be able to give an idea on that.
All right, that would be great, thanks, because we have this amazing coordination body. And it may be that monthly right now is, we're doing so much that some other kind of working level in between the monthly meetings may be helpful. Just a thought.
So a huge caveat that we haven't looked at the resourcing yet. We are in principle taking on the GBEC coordination at some point next year, but just with that caveat. Tying into the program coordination, that would be something we're trying to think about building into that. And I would totally advocate for Chatham House conversation. Stuff like this today is so invaluable for people to share the key information and not be restrained by diplomatic norms or expectations politically. So I think more of these conversations, the better. And then if we start talking more openly about programmatic planning that you guys have, that would be so helpful for us to inform and to
ICCN, we are very also keen to, especially since I'm very new from the private sector, so I see a lot of, not a lot, but I see some redundancy, that's for sure, in terms of programs and all that, so we just try to get our ducks in order. We're starting next week with the first gathering of all our parks partners, just also again to brainstorm collectively and make sure we share our resources and we look into the same direction. And then we'll obviously be looking forward to the same thing with donors as well, just to make sure information is flowing, tools are flowing, because some donors are coming selling some tunes, and then they are not used either by us, and then some other ones do the same thing. Yeah, so one is wasting time and resources, and
よそから来てて、どっかのドラマか知りたいんですかね。
So,
そこは言わなかったですよね。
we are definitely,
どっ
I
から
mean,
サポ
we
ートする
cannot give relief for the entire country, we're just 13% of it in terms of territory, but that's what we want to do now, just keep stuff.
Yeah, I guess I did. Your point on getting someone in the oil industry who really knows his stuff and decided not to bid because it's not a great option to get the numbers about what the
今日
potential
は最後の教授にどうやって
margin is for the Congolese government because that's what
どういうふうに
discussion around and no ideal even to an order of magnitude in terms of
Yes, we
billions
don't,
or nothing.
we don't know if it's
And
10 billion or
What?
it's
yeah,
200 billion. We don't
exactly.
know.
You do
No one
not.
knows.
You do.
Yeah.
ちょっと時間もらって、
No, it's Total and Eni who are the ones who know the most. And really will have thought about this a lot and decided not to go. And that they, I don't know how this would work, but they could do the numbers. I mean, they've already done it for some of it.
Yes, okay,
They
exactly.
must have because they've decided not to.
Yeah, they did.
And then that,
And then you have the numbers, and you obviously have to probably have to divorce it from the companies that become just numbers that some research has done. Then people know. After I published a piece in the New York Times, people saying, I don't want this to happen. How much does it cost to stop it?
yes.
I'll go and find the money.
I just want to actually speak to the New York Times. Thanks, Simon, for actually placing the op-ed about a month or so ago, because I know that on the U.S. side of things, it absolutely helps kick off discussions. So just want to, now that I see you in person, thank you for
彼ら
that.
は
I was gonna say, the one thing that they did, a lot of the Q&A at the meeting was, they had a complaining kind of vibe.
アメリカブリンケンとか
I mean, the voice
イギ
was
リスの
crazy.
首相とかも
Pedantically,
動かせます。
researchers who.
いやいや動かせるの。
But
彼とか今前に座ってる彼とかね。
And the idea was that, they complain about a lot of things like conditionality, avoiding them purposely. So the question is, when do you find the person or the entity in the government that you trust, I'll take a risk with? It's like, they feel very strongly, I think, that all the rules and everything are, belittle them and tie their hands, make them feel seem untrustworthy, if in fact it's not going to register if they're ever the truth or whatever. So the question is, when do you not, how do you ameliorate that? I think is a good deal.
I think the answer is that it's a financial problem and it needs to be addressed in a cash flow perspective, And the thing is, we could even say, okay, well, you're going to get less money from the environment, but you're going to get it now instead of starting 5 years from now or whatever. And so we're basically, I would assume, and again, I'm not talking even from my CCN side, just my own personal theory, that we could, of course, as you say now, it's not really big money to go and all that, but it will have to be done if we want to compensate. You cannot just fund people to do stuff in the country and they don't see the money or touch the money. It's not
That's the point.
That's not what they're looking for. So it means that we need to help them. Put some carbon credit on the market, value it properly in the way it is being stored and added over time, and yes, put the money on the Minister of Finance, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. But the question is how much has to be answered with that specific. With just that specific question of how much is really in it for the government at the end of all the expenses and the profit and all that. So that value we can put a number on it through carbon credits and also through how much does it cost to stop this, like whatever, like you just raise the basket, it's like, and we know it's not going to be properly managed to the dime for sure. But then it stops the thing, and that's what it is.
For you three now.
But it's sort of thing that, they're attempting to start up an entirely new industry to gain funds for central government. And they already have whatever it is, 60-70% of the world's cobalt, and a whole bunch of other stuff, which is worth an astronomical amount. And the bandwidth of the government, logically, ought to be going to make sure that that pays. Not try and do an entirely new industry from scratch.
The cobalt's not in the forest.
Yeah, I mean, well, I know it's not in the forest, but it's providing what appears to be the primary motivation, which is the government needs income.
Yeah.
And that is a bigger source of income and potentially much more stable and much lower risk. If they need to apply the limited resources to gain the income from that rather than this new, whether it's carbon credits or oil. They're both new things that are going to be much riskier than a thing that's actually massive.
But I don't.
Well, the question is it long-term money or is it money for next year?
Well, that is the
different steps there, but
So again, just wanting to be conscious of everyone's time and knowing that we've got business cards to exchange, we all are seeing each other. I think if people are okay if us wrapping about now, and so we can mingle a little bit, keep talking, but this is not an end to this conversation by no means.
Can I ask one last question for you, Victor? So, I don't know, or you're sometimes here, sometimes not here, but especially I meet these guys every day almost. So just wondering, for you, but I think this is a relevant question for us because, I'm working for the embassy here, but also with the point from the Swedish development agency. So it's all connected to how do we value the forest for the development for the people. I have money and I don't have to wait for the Catholic signature and stuff like that. But I think it's more like the question for us is always, as from a donor perspective, creating development, and that's in the interest of the government. We have the same target, all right. And how do we use sort of the research to connect the value of the forest environment to the local development, and then do this sort of connection of where should we focus on, maybe exploration or whatever, these type of things. I'm focused at Swedish University how we can look at aquatic marine system, for example, to have a more sustainable and give the communities, the opportunities for that, and how they're connected. But do you see any sort of, do you do anything like that within your research, or is that something that you would like to expand on a bit more, this human society nature?
For sure, I think it's the whole thing, and we had some limited discussion with Kathy on that, but it's this idea of, we know what the human footprint is, we know the footprint is growing, we know the approximate drivers of that, and again, it's not yet agro-industry, it's not yet oil exploration, it's just a smallholder livelihood.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you maybe intensify that without also, while also having some kind of understanding of boundaries, to conserve nature, and that's a hard one to do, but interventions that can be placed in a larger context, not somewhat arbitrarily to specific, let's say, opportunities that will maximize results. I think spatial data and these trends and dynamics will help plan those activities.
So I would speak to Paolo Chirui from C4 if you get the chance, doing small scale interventions comprehensive interventions on value chains with farmers, people going in agroforestry, people in charcoal, that type of thing. It's that type of management at that scale that I think is needed. And it's more research, so theirs is research focused, it's all pilots. So it's socio-economic and behavioral research essentially. More of that is needed to understand the methodology that works. And that will vary by region just in DRC because of the cultural variations, but research into that and then implementation of that at scale, the methodologies that do work. So I have a conversation with him because what they're doing in Yangambe is to my mind, very impressive.
It's also necessary thing from Gates Foundation. I always talk to them about what their goal was because they're talking about, you see a time where smallholders send their kids to college. And you think that Africa will not go through the land use transition that the West did, where we were 90% farmers and now we're 2% farmers. They never answered the question, clearly. But that's another thing. It's like, what are the economic development opportunities in degraded lands for agro industry and giving jobs to people that are not smallholder transition as opposed to just because if you are successful and make these landscapes up against intact forest profitable, that could just speed up the clearing, because I'm making this much money from this square meter, there's another square meter over there. So it's very weird to think about how you finesse that. And I almost feel like drive attention